In Mr. Pandaria, when it comes to making a 25-man comp, it's pretty easy because Blizzard have homogenized a lot of the buffs and it makes it very simple to be able to basically tick off every raid buff that you need. So at that point, it just becomes class stacking for really good offensive raid buffs or just taking whatever classes do the most damage. In 10-man, it's not that simple because even though you can cover all the raid buffs fairly easily still, you haven't got 15 other slots that you can just start stacking offensive buffs with. There's 2 offensive buffs I'm really talking about before we actually start looking at what an ideal comp might look like, and that's Warriors bringing Skull Banner and Shamans bringing Stormlash Totems. Now, because all the classes are actually quite close in the first phase, which we'll look at some actual numbers before we dive into the comps, you're not really punished by actually stacking as many Stormlash Totems or banners as possible, outside of the fact that you might end up a bit too melee heavy in a 10-man, which of course you're not going to want. Now, Vog, who's a lovely chap on my Discord server, went through the logs of a recent private server where it's only in the first phase of content. There's no Throne of Thunder or anything like that. It's just the first 3 raids. So the gear level that people are in is pretty relevant. And he took the average DPS that they're doing, the top DPS that they're doing, basically the sort of things you'd see on Warcraft logs. Now, of course, because it's such a smaller data sample being on a private server where there's nowhere near as many people as what's going to be playing Classic, it is only so relevant, but it does give us a good idea and it does paint a really good picture from what I personally see when I'm in raids there as well. So firstly, let's tick off the criteria. We're of course going to want 2 tanks, and one of those tanks is going to be able to off-spec DPS on single tank fights. We're going to want 2 healers, and we are going to go with the strongest healers, and I'll explain why, but that doesn't mean that any healers not mentioned aren't viable, because they absolutely are, but we're looking at the optimal comp, or in my opinion, the optimal comp. And I'll do you one better, we're actually going to make 2 comps. And then of course we're going to want to cover all the raid buffs and bring basically the biggest pumpers that we can based on the data that we've got. Firstly, I just want to touch on healers because that's going to be pretty much the most important part. If you look at these numbers, you can see what sort of HPS each of the healers are doing at the top end, at the average, at sort of the 90th percentile, 95th percentile. And I don't want you fixating too much on those numbers. Yes, Resto Shaman's the highest, but actually it's not because of their HPS that makes them almost mandatory in my opinion in a 10-man. And when I say mandatory, take that with a pinch of salt. It's mandatory to me. I think going in a 10-man without a Resto Shaman is the equivalent of going into a 10-man in Cataclysm without a Holy Paladin. If you're just fine without a Holy Paladin in your 10-man because you run Disc Priest and Resto Druid, for example, you're going to be fine in MoP. Again, I really can't stress the fact enough that we are just talking about what is the most optimal, not what is just viable. Because all healers are viable, and I've got a video coming out soon where we're talking about the top 3 of each role, so top 3 melee, top 3 range, top 3 healers, and surprise, surprise, Resto Shaman's in there, but so is Disc Priest and even Resto Druid. But unfortunately, we're only going to take 2 main healers, and then we're going to want a 3rd off-spec healer where we can bring more than just the fact that they can heal on those 3 healer fights. Because there will be fights during progress, and maybe even past progress, where you're going to run 3 healers, much like there is now in Dragon Soul, where you probably use 3 healers for Spine, Madness, potentially even Zonos as well. But we are basing the healer selection off of the most cooldowns that we can get out and the most versatile as well, as in what do they bring outside of just healing. So obviously a Disc Priest, that would be damage. And there's a lot of fights where DPS checks can be quite tight, so obviously Disc Priest is going to be one that we favour. But let's build this out. First of all, we're going to want 2 tanks. Now, my 2 tanks of choice would be a Blood DK, which as soon as you put the DK in, you're covering 10% attack power from Horn of Winter. You're getting an anti-magic zone as well, which is a particularly strong raid cooldown. And I do actually think Blood DK is just going to be as strong as it is in Cataclysm at the moment, and you can't go far wrong with it being your main tank. Now, when it comes to off-tank, you've got a few options here, because you could run Protection Warrior, which is going to bring far more than any of the others. You could run Brewmaster because they're going to be really strong on ads and cleave and general AoE and survivability as well, because monks are very strong. But what we really want to think about here is what are they going to be doing when they're not tanking? Because when they're tanking, quite honestly, any tank could work. You could run double Blood DK. Now, in our 10-man going into Mr. Pandaria, we're actually going to be running a Brewmaster as the off-tank, because that off-tank is going to be me. But in my optimal comp, I would probably put a Protection Warrior there. And the reason I'd put a Protection Warrior is because you're going to get a Skull Banner, When they actually switch to DPS, they're going to be one of the biggest pumpers in the group because Arms Warriors absolutely slap. They're going to bring an extra Vigilance, which is a 30% damage reduction, which they can put on the main tank, and they can still use that even when they're DPS in. It's an extra Demo Banner, which is a 10% damage reduction as well. Of course, they're going to bring Sunder Armor, but we may get to a point in this comp where we've got someone else that can bring that anyway. But overall, the Warrior is going to bring a lot to the raid, and you're not going to be punished when they need to switch DPS because you're just going to keep all of the good stuff that they're actually there for. Whereas if we was to put a Brewmaster in there, they actually bring very little. They've got amazing personal cooldowns, amazing output in terms of AoE, probably the strongest output, but they bring one cooldown really, which is Avert Harm, and it's not really the strongest, whereas you're bringing a Warrior that's going to bring two banners, both offensive, defensive, an extra external cooldown for the tank with Vigilance. They just bring so much. And again, if we focus on the fact that on one tank fights, it's going to be your Warrior that goes DPS, they're going to be absolutely blasting as arms. So we're going to stick with the Blood DK Protection Warrior setup for now. And then moving on to the healers, we're going to run Resto Shaman and we're going to run Disc Priest. Now, the reason for this is the Resto Shaman brings so much raid utility and so many raid cooldowns with Spirit Link, Heal Inside Totem, Ancestral Guidance, which massively increases their healing output when they use it. Stormlash Totem for more damage for the whole raid. Amazing stacked AoE healing with Healing Rain. Extra damage when you need it because they can just stand there spamming Lightning Bolt. The Resto Shaman is like the staple healer in a 10-man comp. I don't think I'm ever going to be convinced otherwise. It really is going to be that strong. Again, you could make this work with a Holy Paladin Disc Priest, but the Resto Shaman toolkit is just huge in Mist of Pandaria. And then the Discipline Priest. They do really, really good output in terms of DPS. They do really good output in terms of heals. They get the addition of Spirit Shell, which is absolutely huge, and used properly can more or less completely trivialize certain mechanics by getting big Spirit Shells out on everyone before damage comes in. And because it's a 10-man, it's very easy for the priest to actually get that out on everyone. Power Word Barrier, which again is just a really strong cooldown. Between the Resto Shaman and the Disc Priest, you've got so many raid cooldowns that for those big moments of damage, you're just not going to need to worry. And even Divine Hymn for Disc Priests. There's just so much output that you can put out with this combination of healers. Okay, and now we really want to cover the third healer. So we're going to want someone that's DPS in 90% of the time, and then there'll be those odd fights like your Spine of Deathwings or Madness or Zonos, where you're going to need this person to heal. Now, we're going to choose this very similarly to how we did with the off-tank, where we want it to be quite a big blast in DPS. We don't want to lose any buffs or anything like that when they change to healer. So working with that, looking at like a Balance Druid, a Shadow Priest, an Elemental Shaman, they will bring the 5% spell haste, which at the moment we're lacking. The problem is, on those free healer fights, we're going to lose that buff. Now, we are most likely going to have a Hunter in, which the Hunter will bring that buff, but then we need to make sure everything else is covered. What we also don't want to do is have whatever healer it is needing two completely different sets of gear, as in early progress, so when we're going in week 1, you're not going to want that person to have to farm pre-raid bis for two completely different specs. So an example of that would be a monk. If you've got a Windwalker monk, ideally you want them to either be flexing into a tank role or they're DPSing. You don't want them going into a healer role because now they literally need two completely different sets of gear. Whereas with things like Balance Druid, Shadow Priest, Airly Shaman, there can be some crossover there and you can almost get away with just healing in your DPS gear, especially if you're just the third healer. You'd probably just change your trinkets or something like that. So for now, until we build this comp out, we're going to put an Ellie Shaman in. And the reason we're putting the Ellie Shaman in is because it's going to bring another Stormlash Totem, more support with things like Ancestral Guidance, even when it's a 2-healer fight, and then all the same reasons that we've already put a Resto Shaman in for anyway. Having a second Resto Shaman, there's no harm in that at all. But what we do need to bear in mind now is that we will lose that 5% spell haste when the shaman has to heal. So ideally what we want to be doing is ticking off all of these other buffs before we actually put a hunter in. Because I've turned Hunter's Pets off, so we know if we can cover all raid buffs without a Hunter being in the group, the Hunter then will be able to bring the 5% spell haste on fights where the Elemental Shaman needs to go resto. Now, ideally, we're going to only want 2 melee. So the first melee, in terms of real big pumpers, is going to be a Sub-Rogue. Sub-Rogue will absolutely be blasting on single target, and they've had so much additions in terms of AoE, they're not even going to lack there. So when we put the sub-rogue in, that's going to cover the 10% attack speed, and with Master Poisoner, it's also going to bring the spell damage taken. Now, we're going to get the spell damage taken anyway, because of course one of the range is going to be a Warlock. I'm sure you've heard how hard Warlocks pump. So what we'll do is we'll put a Destro Lock in now anyway. Now, the Destro Lock really is only being brought for the damage, whereas the Sub-Rogue's being brought for his damage, his attack speed, and even Smoke Bomb, which is now a really, really useful raid cooldown. So you're bringing pretty much the biggest single-target DPS melee class that there is, and getting another important raid cooldown with a 20% DR. Now, at the moment, we're missing 5% stats and 5% crit. This could be covered by literally swapping out the Protection Warrior for a Feral Druid, and this would be absolutely fine. You are just going to be losing that banner. Whereas on the basis Frost Mage does actually pump pretty hard, and we've already got a Warlock in, we're going to round off the 3 range that we want to put in by putting a Frost Mage in, which is going to cover the 5% crit with Arcane Brilliance, and then we know that last spot is for a Hunter. So now we've got 1 spot left for a non-Hunter, which we need to cover 5% stats. So your choices are Monk, Druid, or Paladin. Now, when we actually look at the numbers, in terms of the biggest pump in melee, I honestly would say you don't actually want any of these, which puts us in a bit of a pickle. Instead, what we could do at the loss of a Stormlash totem would be to actually run a Balanced Druid here, or even a Feral Druid. The reason we're not going Feral is again because it comes down to the whole needing 2 sets of gear, whereas if we put a Balanced Druid in here, we're going to get the 5% stats. They are very middle of the pack and will likely do less damage than an Ellie Shaman, but the Druid's going to get Symbiosis, which for certain fights is going to be really useful. You're going to get that 5% stats all the time, and the Balanced Druid is going to cover the 5% spell haste when they're not needed to heal, meaning the Hunter can run a different pet. Now, a Resto Druid is super, super strong in terms of output. They don't bring the powerful raid cooldowns that Resto Shaman and Disc Priest bring, but I think in terms of a well-balanced, rounded-out comp, actually having a Balanced Druid in there instead of a Shaman would work well. Again, we could swap the tank and get rid of the Protection Warrior for a Feral Druid, and then we could run the Ellie Shaman instead, but I am going to fly through a second comp after this anyway. But what this means now, because we're not relying on any other classes to bring buffs, we can put another Arms Warrior in, meaning we've now just covered the last debuff, which is the 4% Fizz damage taken, and we've now got double banners, and then we're finally slotting in the Survival Hunter. Now, with this comp, we've got our third healer flex being the Balanced Druid, we've got the Protection Warrior with a really good arms spec on solo tank fights, and we're very ranged bias over melee, which 9 times out of 10 is a really good thing. Now, this would be an absolutely solid comp and be able to do all content. I could break down on a boss-by-boss basis how this would actually work, but obviously that would make this video about 10 times as long. But having a rogue in the group simplifies Will of the Emperor for soaking sparks, which again you'll know a bit more about as we actually get to talking about raids properly. You've got literally all the biggest pumping DPS classes in one group, again excluding the Balanced Druid, because to be fair, that Balanced Druid spot you could still change, but the only thing I would do there is make sure that I was getting stats from somewhere else and then put another Shaman in. So in that case, I would get rid of the Balanced Druid, I'd get rid of the Protection Warrior, and I'd actually put a Brewmaster in as the off tank, and then I'd put an Ellie Shaman in, so it's actually going to bring more damage, and then you're going to have another Resto Shaman as your third healer. This would actually be my preferred comp personally. I just think the first comp actually gives more utility. But spoiler alert, this exact comp that we've just changed to is pretty much exactly what our group is going to be running in Mist of Pandaria. But I do honestly think having a second banner from a warrior and just superior DPS from your off-tank being an arms warrior would actually be more beneficial than the monk. But for any of you that know me or have watched me for any length of time, you know there's no way I'm playing something that's not a monk. So overall, I think this would be a solid comp. Now, what about if we was to use some of the other classes? We're literally going to fly through this because not a lot will change. But now let's get some other classes in where it's going to be a perfectly viable comp still and you're going to cover everything. I would still go Blood DK main tank because I do truly believe they're going to be the strongest. We're going to go Prot Warrior for all the reasons we discussed before, but for the healing comp, we're going to go Resto Shaman and Resto Druid together. Now, this will be absolutely fine because what you could do now is run a Shadow Priest, and then on fights where you're going to run a third healer, which is normally going to be the fights where a lot of healing's needed, obviously, you're now getting the Disc Priest on those important fights anyway. We're then going to put a Hunter in, which again is going to be covering the 5% haste when the Shadow Priest needs to respec. deck. For melee, we're going to go Unholy DK because in Phase 1, Unholy DK really does slap, and you've only got to look at the numbers to back that up, where you got Warriors, Rogues, and Unholy DKs all at the top. Purely for damage and the 5% crit, we're still going to run Destruction Warlock and Frost Mage because, quite honestly, both of these do so much damage that you're not going to want to run without them. And then we've got one spot, which we could chuck another melee in there or another ranged. Because we've covered all the important buffs and debuffs already, and there's only a few raid cooldowns that we're missing, which we aren't actually missing because we'll get barrier on the fights where the shadow is disc, you can more or less put anything in here at all. If you want pure single target and you want a melee, then you could take the sub-rogue. You could even take a feral druid, a ret paladin, a windwalker monk, an arms warrior, enhancement shaman. Literally, this last spot now would be completely flex. You could put anything you want in there. Me personally, what I'd put in there would probably be a sub-rogue, just so we've got a more balanced comp where we've got 4 ranged DPS and 2 melee. But quite honestly, it would leave this spot completely open. But there is an argument that you could then put an arms warrior in instead, because what that's then going to do is give you another banner, give you another vigilance. Like, you're just going to get so much. Bringing a warrior brings so much utility and damage, because as I say, they're big pumpers as well. But I think overall, you can see generally how you should be making your comp up, even if you didn't copy one of those, because I gave you 3 variations there. Even if you didn't copy them exact, as long as you follow that same sort of way of thinking, you'll be able to build out a comp that's going to be very successful. I actually really like this third comp that we've looked at, but as I say, the second comp that we done with the Brewmaster Monk being the off tank is what we're actually going to run. And that's it. There's 3 variations of raid groups there. Use whichever one you want or just make your own. In the last raid comp we looked at, if you were to run it exactly and just leave that 10th spot empty, you can pretty much take anything you want, including something that is a bit more middle of the pack and worry less about stacking offensive raid buffs. But I still would say that last spot, just go into something that's going to bring more damage to everybody else, like an arms warrior or a shaman, is probably the way to go. But cool, that's it. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe. Consider joining the channel as a member if you want to show extra support, and I'll see you on the next one.